Well, good morning and welcome to Highland today. Glad to have all of you here on Veterans Day weekend. And so we want to say to everyone who has served in the military, thank you so much. I think as we look around the world today, as we look around the world today, we recognize how important military is. That without the service of people in the military over the years here, we would not exist as a country because somebody would come and run us over, no doubt. And so we're grateful for the service you have done. Beyond that this morning, before I get started into the message, I wanted to say thank you to all of you who have parked along the middle school, opening up some spaces out here in the main lot. Grateful for that. And want to ask if a few more might be willing to do that. I walked around the parking lot last Sunday as you were singing the last song, and there were only 2 spots that were open out there. And so 2 is 2. That's a good thing. It's better than none, but a few more would be nice. We don't need 20 spaces open, but I want you to imagine somebody coming in as a guest looking for a place to park, and if they can't find a spot or if they're really struggling to find one, and then they drive off and leave. We definitely want to avoid that. And so, again, grateful for those of you who have parked over here along the middle school. If there would be a few more that would be willing to do that on a regular basis, open up a few more spots. I know it can be kind of discouraging when you park over there and you walk by and then you see 12 spaces out here that are open. You go, well, I could have parked there. But that's kind of what we need, is we need 12 spots open. We need several open like that so that somebody coming in for the first time, or somebody who's coming in and maybe they are older, or they have several kids and a lot of things to bring in, a good spot not so far away is helpful to them. So I'd ask a few more of you if you'd be willing to do that. Also, want to encourage you to look at the Engage page. You always get one of those handed to you when you walk in, but I've heard a number of people say they take it and they never look at it. Shame on you. So there's always a good devotional there that goes along with the message. Mike McElhier writes those. He does an awesome job with them. Just gives you a chance to reflect a little further on what we've talked about on Sunday morning. And I would encourage you to do that on your own, but also, of course, on the flip side of that, there are several announcements that are there. So if you want to be aware of what's going on in the church, that's where you can find out a good bit of that information. Again, I'm surprised how many people will say, I didn't know that was happening. Well, it's been on the Engage page for a month. And so take the time to read that and look. Something I would point out there today for you is that I'm trying to arrange a Canadian fishing trip for some men to go in July. And so information is there if you want to take a look at that, if you have some interest in going. And then you can send me an email as is directed there if you'd be interested in further information. And then finally, before I get started into the message, Kim Harper, who is our children's minister, has returned with her family recently from the Dominican Republic. And they've been in a 7-year adoption process. I think that's kind of the long end of normal for adoption. It is kind of a lengthy process, but that's the long end of normal for that. But I think God was working out the timing for everything to come together for that. And so they were there completing that process, but they are home now. So she and her husband, Justin, and their 5 kids went and were there for a number of weeks into months. And they have just recently returned with Francis. Today happens to be Adoption Sunday, a Sunday where a lot of churches and people recognize that and talk about that issue of adoption. But Kim and her family wanted to express their gratitude to you, to the church, for the immense support that has been given in terms of prayer and encouragement and even finances to help them along this journey. They are very thankful for that and wanted you to know that, and wanted you to know their home and beginning the process of integrating Francis into a new home here. And along with that, they wanted to say that if any of you have some thoughts about adoption, they say they're not experts on the subject, but they've been through a long process and have gained a lot of knowledge about it. And so if you'd like to talk to them about that, they would be willing to talk and just kind of see if maybe God has that in your path as well. Because the Bible challenges us, directs us, and instructs us to care for widows and orphans. And so if you'd like to talk to them, get in touch with them. They'd be happy to talk to you about that. We're going to be in Ephesians chapter 5 today. And so if you have your Bible, I'd encourage you to go ahead and turn there. I remember seeing a video one time of a toddler getting his first pair of glasses. Apparently, this child had been born with just very blurry vision for whatever reason, needed corrective lenses. But of course, when you're a baby and a toddler, you have no way of expressing that. How do you know that's not even normal? How do parents know that that's what's going on? But as the child was getting a little older, the parents kind of began to figure out, we think something is wrong here. So they took the child to an optometrist. They got his very first pair of glasses. They were really thick corrective lenses, but they had a video then of when they put the glasses on the child for the first time. And there was this moment of discovery. Like the look on this toddler's face, just eyes wide open and mouth dropping open and just turning his head, looking all around the room as he's seeing things clearly for the very first time in his life. And then his mom spoke and he recognized her voice. And so he turned and looked at her, and this enormous smile came over his face as he saw his mom in a different light for the first time. Have you ever had an experience like that with the Bible? Like there was something that didn't quite make sense, something you didn't fully understand, but then you heard a sermon or you read a book or a devotional, and it gave an explanation that brought it all into focus, and suddenly you could clearly see what you had never seen before. What didn't make sense suddenly did. I hope that some of us have a moment like that today, because this morning we're continuing our study through Ephesians, and we come to the passage, "Wives, submit to your husbands." I think for us today in our culture, we read that and we think that just doesn't sit right. Maybe you're even a Christian and you think, well, I believe in the Bible, so it's got to be true, but what does it really mean? Because we might think of submit as being a doormat, where the wife has to just do everything that the husband commands her to do. We think of submit as being dominated and forced and suppressed. Maybe the image that comes to mind is that of an MMA cage fighter. You know, there's this battle for dominance, and somebody eventually gets in a chokehold and is like, okay, I submit. We kind of have that image when we think of that word. But that is not what this means when we look at it in its full context. So I want us to get a better view of this today through the correct lens and perhaps see more clearly what we have never seen before. So the first thing I want to do is put this passage in its context of the rest of the book of Ephesians. I've mentioned a number of times as we've made our way through this study that you can break Ephesians down into two halves. The first half, the first 3 chapters, talk all about our identity in Jesus, that we are Christians, we are his followers, we are a part of his family. And then the second half, chapters 4 through 6, then are because of that identity, because we are followers of Jesus, how then do we live? How are we supposed to behave and live in life? And so, as we've looked through chapters 4 and following so far, we've seen Paul tells us our mind should be changed. So because we are followers of Jesus, our mind should be changed. Our thoughts should be different. Chapter 4, verse 17, Paul said, "You must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They're darkened in their understanding, separated from the love of God because of the ignorance that is in them." We talked then one Sunday about how our words should be changed. We should speak differently from the world. What comes out of our mouth should reflect that we are followers of Jesus. And so in chapter 4, verse 29, "Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up." Last Sunday we talked about how our behavior should change. Chapter 5, verse 3, "Among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or greed, because these are improper for God's holy people." So he tells us that should not be a part of our life when we're a follower of Jesus. Today, what we're going to see is that Paul says when we're followers of Jesus, our relationships should change. So I think it's important to understand this controversial verse in that context. in the context of the whole book and the argument that Paul is making, the flow of thought that he has. Here's who you are as a believer of Jesus. We are followers of him. Because of that, here is how we should live. And he doesn't just come out of nowhere and say, wives, submit to your husbands. It's in the context of, because of who we are as believers, here is how we should live. And that's not the only thing he talks about. He talks about our words and our behaviors and our mind, all those pieces. So this is the context in which it fits. So I want you to look with me in chapter 5, verse 21. And this verse is the heading to this section about how our relationships should change as followers of Jesus. This is the overriding thought for this entire section. And here's what it says. Chapter 5, verse 21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. All right, that's important to know. Submit to one another. So before he gets to a part where he says, wives, submit to your husbands, he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. But how would that work? How do two people both submit to one another? Paul goes on and gives 3 examples of different kinds of relationships and how this works. So in chapter 5, verses 22 through 33, he talks about this idea of husbands and wives. He goes on in chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and he talks about how it works between parents and children. He goes on from there in chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, and he demonstrates how this works between masters and slaves. Now, in the context of our world today, it would be more like the context of employer and employee. We think of master and slave in a really negative context because of the history of our country. But in those days, there was a little bit of that went on. There was some, if they conquered another nation, they would take slaves. But a lot of it was really just working off a debt. Like, I don't have the money to pay this debt, and so I become your servant to work off this debt. So it was kind of somewhere between what we would typically think of master and slave and employer-employee. Just as an employee has some submission to their employer, I do what you say, you're the one giving directions. So when we talk about masters and slaves, it's more applicable to us to think about it in terms of employer-employee. So we're going to look at these 3 different kinds of relationships here today. But we need to understand the context of their culture that Paul was writing into there in Rome. So in the first century Roman culture, they had what was commonly known as a household code. And it was their cultural norms for behaviors between people in the house. These codes demonstrated their social order, their structure throughout the Roman Empire. These were the understood rules about your place in society. So how do people of society relate to each other in the Roman culture? Well, they had cultural norms. Here's how this works. And their homes included not only a husband and wife and 2 kids and a dog, but slaves. So there was kind of that employer-employee relationship in the home as well. It was a workplace. Their homes also included shrines to their gods. And so it was a place of worship. It was their church. It also included extended family. So it wouldn't just be, husband, wife, kids, that there was a husband that was overseeing, but it was, like brothers and the brother's wife and the brother's children. And so there was all of this under the same roof. And so there was a very hierarchical structure. And so the father, or if the father was not alive, the oldest living male in the house. So maybe it was grandpa, maybe it was dad, but if both of those had died, then it's going to be the oldest living son takes charge and would oversee the entire family in that way. And he was called the paterfamilias. And that was actually a Latin term that just means head of the household. He's the head of the house and everything that goes on. And the rest of the family would submit to him like an MMA cage fighter would submit to somebody that got in a chokehold. He had absolute authority over the house. He had authority over the people, the possessions, everybody, extended family, kids. He could punish family members, any of them. Like if I were the head of the family and my brother's wife did something that I didn't like, I could punish her. That was the head of the family in that culture. He could punish the slaves of the house. He could prevent or end a marriage. One of my nephews is wanting to get married. No. Like that was the head of the household in that culture. He could sell his children as slaves. I have a debt to pay. I'll sell one of my kids in order to pay off that debt. When a baby was born, he could accept or reject the baby. When a baby was born into the household, the baby was brought and placed before the head of the household, and if he accepted the baby, and the baby then could be raised in that house, he would pick the child up. But if he rejected the child, he would simply walk away. He could reject that child for any reason. Maybe it was a girl and he wanted a boy. Maybe there was some deformity. And so if that baby was rejected, they would take the baby out and put the baby in the woods to die of exposure, or sometimes throw them in the river to drown. Seneca, a Roman politician, wrote, "We slaughter a fierce ox, we strangle a mad dog, we plunge a knife into a sick cow, and children born weak or deformed, we drown." That was their culture, and that was what the head of the household had the authority to do according to their social structure. The head of the house was also the priest of the family. Whatever God he decided to worship, the rest of the family would worship that God. Now, isn't that kind of what we think of when we think of that word submit? Wives, submit to your husbands. Like, the husband has control, she has to do what he says. But into that culture, Paul wrote, as Christians, your relationships should change. You should submit to one another. And not just husband and wife, but everybody in the church. Everybody who is a follower of Jesus. You should submit to one another. Followers of Jesus, he said, have a different household code, a different relationship code, a different way that you relate to each other. It's not that one is the ruler and the other is the ruled over. He said, submit to one another. So, let's look at these examples, these 3 examples that Paul gives us about how this should work. And even though in the text, husband and wife comes first, I'm going to save that one for last, because I think when we talk about these other 2 first, it helps bring that husband and wife relationship into greater focus. It helps us understand it in a different way, because that is the one that so many in our culture have struggled with, because it's just kind of reached in there, grabbed, pulled out of context, and drawn out, and nobody pays any attention to what it says about employers and employees and other relationships. It's just like, wait, I don't like that one verse, so I'm just going to pull that out and tear that apart. So we're going to look at that one last. So we're going to start with slaves and masters, or in our culture, employees and employers. Now, I think we understand how a slave would submit to his master. That makes complete sense to us. There is a structure of authority, and the slave follows the master's directions. The employee follows the directions of the employer. But how would a master submit to a slave? How would an employer submit to an employee? In the military, I think we understand how a private would submit to a sergeant, but how would a sergeant submit to a private? And yet, this is what Paul tells us should happen. Look with me, chapter 6, beginning in verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Makes complete sense to us. We understand that. But it goes on in verse 9. Also, masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. See the mutual submission that's there? Paul is telling them both to do the same thing, relate to each other in the same way. And he says the reason for this is because you both, as believers, have the same master in heaven. You are both under the same authority. And so because of that, slaves, employees, submit to your employer, but employer, submit to your employee. Submit to one another. So, slaves, obey, serve him as though you're serving the Lord. Masters, treat yourselves, your slaves in like manner. Don't threaten, don't beat, don't make their lives miserable. So there's still a hierarchical structure. The master is still the master, the slave is still the slave. The boss is still the boss, the employee is still the employee. The sergeant is still sergeant, private still private. There's still an order that has to be given, an order that has to be followed. The difference is in how they relate to each other in mutual submission. Now maybe we can better understand this if we just put it in a different perspective. And that perspective would be this. When we submit to each other, we are looking out for the interest and welfare of the other instead of ourselves. So, slave, you're not just obeying commands, but you are looking out for the interest of your master. Master, you're not just giving orders, but you are looking out for the welfare of your slave. Employee, you are not just trying to get what you want and do the least amount of work possible for the most pay. An employer, you are not just trying to take advantage of your employees to try to build yourself up. There is mutual submission. Employees, work for your boss as though you're working for the Lord. Boss, treat your employee like your employee is the Lord. You're treating each other well. Now, somebody might ask, well, in this context of masters and slaves, why didn't Paul just call for the abolition of slavery? Why wouldn't he say, do away with it, masters, you should set your slaves free? Well, you've got to understand that the church at that time was this very small minority of a Roman Empire. So you've got these people who have converted to follow Jesus, but you've got this Roman government that you are not going to be able to change. Like, Paul couldn't go to the emperor and say, hey, slavery is wrong, you need to do away with this. That would be kind of like the Christians of China going to the leader of China saying, hey, you need to allow us to worship as we want. It's not going to happen. And so how do you play a game that you didn't create by rules that you didn't invent? You change the players of the game. And so you're simply telling the slaves and the masters that exist, that you know are not going to change in that culture, here's how you relate to each other. Here's how you do this as believers in Jesus. So Paul said, as Christians, the way we relate to each other is mutual submission. We look out for the interests of the other. So Paul then talks about another example, that of parents and children. So he goes on, hey, here's another way that this works for mutual submission. Now this is similar to slaves and masters in that we understand how children would submit to their parents. Makes complete sense to us. How does a parent submit to their child? That doesn't make much sense at all, does it? Yet, in chapter 6, verse 1, Paul wrote, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. But fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So for the children, he says, obey. That has to do with action. He talks about honor. That has to do with attitude. And so he's saying, follow the instruction of your parents with a good attitude. This honors the Lord. If they give you a chore to do your chore without complaining. If they give you a curfew, be home by that time. Don't roll your eyes and huff and puff and slam the door. For parents, this means don't provoke your children to anger. This is talking about a repeated, ongoing pattern of treatment that over time builds resentment and eventually boils over. Let's say that an example of this would just be constant teasing. Maybe there's the boy is becoming a teenager and developing an interest in girls, and his dad just starts teasing him about everything. Girls at school, who did you sit by on the bus? Did you give her a Valentine card? Making smoochy sounds until it just boils over and the child erupts. That is exasperating your child. Maybe it would be something like making your child a servant. I think household chores are good for kids. It teaches responsibility. Those things of make your bed, take out the trash, wash the dishes, mow the yard, whatever those household, you need to learn to be responsible and a part of the household. But this can cross a line into the parents just making their kids do whatever they don't want to do. Like, this is a job I don't want, so I'll make my child do it. That's exasperating your child. Maybe this would be something like pushing your child for greater and greater achievement no matter how good they do. No matter how good their grades are, you're pushing them for more. You have to do better. You've got to get that college scholarship. No matter how many points they score in the game, well, you did a good job scoring points, but your defense was terrible. And just constantly pushing. Now, again, challenging is a good thing, but it can cross a line into exasperation. And so, Paul says, there is a hierarchy of authority. The parent is still a parent, and the child is still the child. The parent is going to give instruction, and the child is going to follow. But there is mutual submission. Even though the parent is in charge, the parent is looking out for the interest of the children. And even though the child might feel put upon at times, we're all that way when we're kids. I don't want to do this. I don't want to follow my parents' instruction. But the child is also to look out for the interest of the parent. I am going to do what is best for you. And so, kids, when your parents give direction, follow that direction as you would follow the Lord. But parents, don't exasperate your kids. Look out for their best interests. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about the third example that Paul uses to describe how mutual submission works, and that is between husbands and wives. So the principle is the same here. There's a human structure that God has put in place. The Bible does tell us that the husband is the leader of the home, but it says they don't use their position to get what they want. They look out for the interest of their wife. They love their wife just as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? Gave himself up for it. So chapter 5, verse 22, Paul wrote the very famous words, "Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. But husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." So there is a structure. Just as there is a structure between parents and kids, just as there is a structure between employer and employee, there is a structure in the house that God put in place between husband and wife. The husband is the head of the house, the head of the wife, and he does say, submit yourself to your husband just as you would submit yourself to the Lord. But the follow-up of that is husbands don't take advantage of that. Don't just look out for your own interests and say, wife, you have to do whatever I say, but you are loving your wife just as Christ loved the church, giving yourself up for her and saying, I will not take advantage of this, but instead I will look out for the interest of my wife. I will put her needs ahead of my own. You know, as we read this text today, as we all know, the most radical part that jumps out at everybody is that statement, wives, submit to your husbands. Everybody gravitates toward that. Like, That just doesn't make sense in our age of women's suffrage and liberation and feminism and equality and equal rights. It sounds wrong to say, wives, submit to your husbands. But do you know that when this was written in the first century, the most radical part of this was, husbands, love your wives? That's what would have jumped out to the original readers. When Paul wrote, wives, submit to your husbands, everybody would have gone, yes, we know. That's what our culture is. When Paul came back and said, husbands, love your wives, submit to one another in the family relationship, people would have gone, oh, what? But Paul says, when you're a follower of Jesus, your relationships change. We relate to each other differently. Submit to one another. Wives to your husbands, husbands to your wives. So what does this look like in a marriage today? Well, it means looking out for the interest of the other. It means wives look out for the interest of their husbands, and husbands look out for the interest of their wives. It means putting her needs ahead of yours. It means putting his needs ahead of yours. It could mean listening instead of speaking. It could mean doing the dishes instead of going golfing. It could mean watching ESPN instead of Hallmark. Definitely what that means. It could mean giving up the vacation that you want. What did I miss? It could mean not walking out on stage behind your husband because you're looking out for his interests ahead of your own. Okay, I gotta look everywhere. Where am I now? She just completely broke my train of thought. It could mean giving up your vacation that you want for the vacation that your spouse wants. But can you imagine a marriage where the husband and the wife both have a different idea for vacation this year, and each one is saying, no, let's go do what you want to do, instead of each one pulling for what they want? Can you imagine what it would be like to live in a world of mutual submission where everybody looked out for everyone else instead of themselves? Can you imagine a workplace where the employees showed up 15 minutes early when they needed to, even though they didn't get paid for those extra 15 minutes, because they were going to jump in and help their boss in a stressful situation? Can you imagine a home where children go to bed without being told 12 times to go to bed? And parents would then go to read a bedtime story to their kids, even though they're tired because they worked 10 hours that day and they're worn out. Can you imagine a church where people parked in the far spaces out of the parking lot so that others could have those prime spots? You know, in theory, I think most of us want this. I think we like this idea. We like the thought of that kind of a marriage and that kind of a relationship with our kids and that kind of a workplace and that kind of a church. But our fear in actually doing it is that the other person won't reciprocate. And that stops us from this a lot of the time. We feel like if I give in to look out for their interests, they won't do the same for me. If I watch Hallmark tonight, we won't watch ESPN tomorrow, but she'll want to watch Hallmark again. We kind of feel like if we go on his preferred vacation this year, next year he'll have another one that he wants to go on, and we'll never get to go where I want to go. We feel like if I show up to work early, my boss won't even notice. We feel like if I don't push my curfew, my parents will never let me stay out later. And that is going to happen sometimes because people are selfish. And we look out for our own interests instead of others. But Jesus looked out for our interests. even when we didn't look out for his. In Philippians 2, Paul wrote about Jesus demonstrating this kind of attitude. Paul said, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. Not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself." That word could also be translated submitted. He submitted himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And so if Jesus submitted himself to you, how will you respond to him? Will you submit yourself to him in return? Will you turn your life over to him, be baptized, and have your sin washed away? If you are ready to do that, I'll be in the lobby after service, and you can find me there. And we can talk about your submission to Christ. Pray with me. Father, I pray that this would happen in our families, in our homes, in our marriage, in our church, and in our faith, that we would change our relationships by submitting to one another. In Christ's name, amen.